All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this June's convening of the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force. We're excited for today's presentation, so let's go over a quick agenda. Today, we are going to be hearing from Elena Wilkin, the Executive Director of Housing Colorado, one of NHC's valuable members, and she will be discussing Housing Colorado's supplemental Paycheck to Paycheck report, as well as the state of housing and related legislation in the state of Colorado. Before we jump into that, we're going to have some brief updates from us, the National Housing Conference, and then after Elena's presentation, we're going to move into a Q&A portion of the presentation. As always, before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation today, we encourage you to please ask them in the question box on your little toolbox in the side. We will moderate them and be able to engage in conversation with Elena after she finished presenting, and we really encourage everyone to engage with us here. Additionally, if you have any issues or need some support with the GoToWebinar service, please visit the website listed here, and hopefully we'll be able to figure any issues out that way. Finally, there's also going to be a link to view the presentation sent out to everyone who is registered today, as well as the slides that are going to be shown in this presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tristan Bro, our Policy Director here at NHC, for some brief updates on our end.
Thank you, Nathan, for all that you do for putting this together every single month, and thank you for the intro. Thank you to Elena also for jumping on and your hard work and commitment to housing and in showing for this webinar on the importance of your Paycheck to Paycheck report. On the NHC side, did want to give a couple of updates for our Paycheck to Paycheck. We had about 300 views within the last week or so, and we expanded our metropolitan areas from 200 in 2017 to about 260 in 2018 across 81 different occupations. And so we're trying to expand across the country slowly but surely. And so we're looking forward to working with all of our members in all of our states to try to get that those metropolitan areas expanded and showing that we break down the Paycheck report. We're working to kind of break these numbers down a little bit to all 29 states where we have members. Currently, of course, we have 30 states that have members, but the wonderful standalone of Colorado is already doing it, and so the other 29 members we hope to get on board as well, and making sure that they have they break down those numbers and make it come home and make it personal for those on the ground. So we're happy that Elena, kind of jumped in today to show the benefits of how this works and how it hits home for particularly those who are on the grassroots level in every particular state. On the NHC policy side, we are going to have our Black Home Ownership Task Force meeting this week. Most of you who are keeping up with the work of NHC, we are sounding like a broken record at this point, that African American home ownership is lower now than when segregation was legal and the Fair Housing Act was signed. And so we are trying to figure out ways to increase African American home ownership and minority home ownership across the country, and trying to figure out ways to increase marketing products and increase communications to the Black community, and just find various ways to increase that number as they were hit the hardest after the 2009 financial crisis. And so we want to be the leaders along with the coalitions that we have all across the country to make sure that we are raising the profile and raising this issue towards Congress. Our GSE reform working group met last week. They're putting together a response to the White House memo on GSE reform, so that should be coming out very, very soon. The White House memo has been out for a while now, and so I know that a lot of members have been asking what NHC will be doing in response to that. And so we should have a firm document in response to the President and the Treasury Secretary, as well as the GSEs and FHFA within that memo, and have a firm response to it. We're also expanding our focus on the National Housing Act of 2021. And so we're engaging with members across the country and having preliminary meetings and strategy sessions coming up in the middle of the summer to talk about different ways to expand our comprehensive bill. There's going to be a very large bill, but a very comprehensive bill because we're well overdue for a new National Housing Act. And so with that, that's all on the policy side, but I'm definitely looking forward to listening to the great work of Housing Colorado and how we can expand that to our other states and localities and breaking it down so it can hit home for a lot of our members. And so thank you, Lane, and also thank you, Nathan, for all that you do.
Great, thank you, Tristan. With that, I'm going to flip it over to Elena. So excited to listen in.
Okay, thank you, Tristan, and thank you, Nathan. Hope everybody can hear me and see my screen. My name is Elena Wilkin. I am the Executive Director of Housing Colorado. And I wanted to give you a little bit about what we are, just to kind of orient you. We are a statewide membership organization. We have just under actually 300 members, and we do run our membership on organization, not by the individual. So as you can see from our list, we've got developers, financiers, nonprofits, state, regional, local governments, architects, service providers, banks, land trust, real estate, title insurance, and so it's a really diverse membership. And I want to kind of bring this to your attention because I'm going to pick it back up when I talk a little bit later about our legislative strategy and how the Paycheck to Paycheck report really played into what we're trying to do as an advocacy organization. So as with any good, solid membership organization, we offer like two main things. We do professional development and networking. So you can see a picture from our recent Eagle Awards that we had in May. We also have an annual conference in October with 850 attendees, a big trade show, lots of workshop sessions, keynote speakers. It is sort of the regional draw. One, because Colorado is gorgeous in October, also because we probably have the most dynamic piece of the housing industry in our sort of southwestern mountain region. So we also do a lot of monthly training around kind of all types of aspects addressing affordable housing in Colorado. We do a lot of networking events, both for our industry as a whole. We've also tried to help our young professionals get oriented in the industry, so we have some separate networking events for them. And then, of course, we do state advocacy. We also do federal advocacy. Since I'm relatively new, I haven't really got my feet wet in that yet. So really the state focus is what I'm going to talk about today and how we use the Paycheck to Paycheck report for those efforts. Oops, that's not right. We're not done quite yet. So the state of housing in Colorado, I'm pretty sad to tell you, although I don't think this is going to be any surprise to anybody, we are failing in affordable housing all over the state and at every point across the housing continuum. So our homelessness numbers are rising. The lack of affordability for those below 60% AMI is statewide, and I'll talk about why it's statewide in a little bit. Workforce housing is becoming a greater and greater issue, and home ownership is becoming out of reach for many of our families. And as Tristan alluded to, we actually have worse numbers for minority home ownership than the rest of the country. So none of those are statistics that we're proud of. We definitely have a lot of work cut out for us. Let me see if the next slide is, yeah, so here's why we're struggling with home ownership in Colorado. We have grown significantly. We're the 13th highest growth rate in the U.S. We're at just shy of 6 million people, which I know doesn't sound like a lot to our friends on the East and West Coast, but for a state that actually has fairly limited land availability, and we're certainly limited by water, and our transportation structure isn't really built to deal with this, it has all kind of led to an ownership affordability problem throughout the state. Setting a little bit of the stage for why we looked at the legislative session the way we did this year. It was a historic midterm election. I think we all know that. The highest turnout since 1914. In Colorado, we had a really high turnout. Almost 62% of our voters turned out to vote. And as a result, we ended up with a Democrat trifecta. So we have both the House, the Senate, and the governor. We also now have a female majority, which is super exciting for those of us who have been working in this area for a long time. So I'm going to give you the punchline of my presentation right now. Really, a lot of the success that we saw was due to this particular coming together of forces, not anything spectacular on this side of what the advocates did. But nonetheless, we had a trifecta, and that really changes the way that you approach a legislative session. So our legislative session starts January, it was really early this year, I want to say the 3rd or 4th. And it ended on the 6th of May. So pretty short session. We do meet every year, for state pieces. So our 2019 priorities this year were dedicated sustainable, durable funding for housing. The housing advocates in Colorado have been working on this for about 25 years. So ever since Housing Colorado was founded. So this is not a new idea. I stepped into a lot of really well thought out policy that had already been negotiated at a whole bunch of different tables. The reasons that it's hard in Colorado, I don't think these are wildly different from a lot of other states except for our one issue. Tabor, the very first one that you'll see on that slide, is called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It was passed in the 90s. This requires any funding increase, any tax increase to go to a vote of the people, a statewide vote. So we have actually not increased our state sales tax since this passed, except for we passed a marijuana tax, we passed alcohol taxes, and we passed gambling taxes. So we're really happy to tax the sins. We are not happy to tax sales, transportation, gas, real estate, any of the other things that are typically available in our funding toolbox. Colorado doesn't have. So we had to get super creative in finding funding that was dedicated, sustainable, durable for housing. So when I get into the wonky part, and you'll understand why we had to go to such strange lengths to find this money. The second issue that we have to fight continuously in Colorado is that housing is considered a local issue. And a lot of people think, and legislators included, that local entities should be able to deal with housing at their place. I kind of liken it to a tube of toothpaste. If you squeeze it some in one place, it's going to come squirting out somewhere else. So I don't actually think housing is as local as people think it is. In fact, we just had a study done that said that most of the renters in Denver are actually looking to move out of Denver for something cheaper to one of the suburbs, or even as far away as some of our eastern towns. So they're starting to feel housing pressure in areas that have typically been very affordable, are now starting to see the kind of commute commitments that people on the East and West Coast have been living with for years, over an hour to get into your work because you want to find that house that you can buy or rent. Lots of debate on the funding source. Like I said, we can't go for a sales, it's difficult to go to a sales tax increase. So there was a lot of discussion about what we should use as the funding. And then, of course, there's always the question about where on the spectrum should state legislation land. Are we, targeting low-income folks? Are we looking at homeless prevention, home ownership? So when you see the legislation that we actually did pass, it's fairly broad. So we never actually had the hard discussion about where this money should go. It was kind of let's leave it up to the state to decide. The other big priority that came up a lot this year was the landlord-tenant relationship. We had a lot of bills passed, which I will not talk about today, but they really tried to hone in on evictions, warrant of habitability, who's responsible for bed bugs, and then rental application fees. So those were kind of the two big things that we worked on in January through May. So how did we use the Paycheck to Paycheck report? So this is the second year that we've partnered with the National Housing Council, and so we tried to use this as for two purposes. One was to just kind of demonstrate the need. Unfortunately, I don't think that is a hard message to sell anymore to anyone in Colorado. Conservatives and liberals both understand that housing is really, really hard and difficult, and the tie to the economic development piece has actually been really well made by both our national partners and by state level advocates. So nobody was telling me it's not a problem. The big debate was on what's the solution. So when we released the Paycheck to Paycheck report, it wasn't new news. I do think what was surprising was how much change we had seen from the 2014 report. So we got a lot more red dots. And again, that's just kind of bringing home that this is a statewide issue, a statewide crisis, and that, all aspects of our economic system are affected by it now. So that the visual is very, very helpful. We did a pretty robust social media campaign. I have a really great staff member who's very social media savvy. Her name's Dora. And she just did a really nice job kind of laying out a good social media campaign where we just kind of kept up a steady drumbeat. It wasn't, like I said, since it's not new news, it wasn't a big flash, but it was really making sure we were targeting the right areas of the state with the right message. And then we had it translated into Spanish a couple weeks later, and then that was kind of a second rollout, which was really fun for us to be able to both put out there and also have on our website. So that was our sort of strategy around it. So here's the map of Colorado. Yes, we are the square state, and the stars indicate the metropolitan areas that we targeted for the Paycheck to Paycheck report. It's right along what we call the Front Range. So that big red road is our north-south interstate. And in fact, housing is an issue all along the Front Range, and it's very fungible. Like I do see a lot of people moving out of the Denver metro area into the suburbs or into Fort Collins or down south into Pueblo. We also have housing unaffordability going up the I-70 corridor. So a lot of our mountain towns, they have had issues around affordability for decades, frankly, because of the resort nature of what they do. But we're also seeing a lot of numbers on both the eastern plains and the western slope now. There's two issues there. One is the AMIs are coming in so low that it's really hard to pencil in projects. And the second problem is our housing stock is substandard. And so it takes a lot of investment to bring the housing that does exist up to habitability. So statewide issue, we really focused for this presentation on the north-south corridor. So two pieces that we've kind of been wrestling with in Colorado. These are not new. I'm sure those of you on the phone have these also, but it's not my problem, right? It's somebody else's problem. Like, again, it's the local control. Well, I can't really deal with this. That means Boulder needs to handle it, or Adams County needs to handle it, or, Lyman needs to, whatever the entity is, it's not my problem. And then, of course, the second one is the not my people. So the really nice thing about the Paycheck to Paycheck report is you could say, someone from outside Denver can say, well, that's not our problem. That's Denver's problem. You can say, well, no, actually, look, the numbers in Pueblo are pretty bad, too, or the numbers in Fort Collins are pretty grim, And then the not my people syndrome, it's this, we picked the industries that are fast growing. The need for all 5 of these are really fast growing in Colorado, and everybody knows somebody who's in these professions. And so it really personalizes it when you think, oh my gosh, this lady who's cleaning my teeth, she cannot afford to rent or buy in any community in Colorado except for Pueblo. Like I feel like that's a very personal message as opposed to, oh, it's somebody else's, somebody else who has this problem. So that was part of the strategy we've used to talk about this report and the results from it. So the results we got from the campaign itself, we got a number of articles in the local newspapers. And again, Dora did a really nice job building a list of media contacts and sending out personalized emails that said, hey, I know you've covered this issue in the past. We have this new report. We'd love to have, some coverage on this. And if you have any questions, call myself or Elaine or whatever. And again, I said with the social media campaign, a pretty well targeted, how can we hit these specific communities that are listed in the report. And as Housing Colorado, since we're a statewide organization, we constantly have to pull back from the Denver center. Like Denver is kind of this, all the money is here and all the population's here, all the numbers are here. So we really need to make sure we just keep pulling back from the Denver center for a number of reasons. One is to maintain our vibrant industry and our vibrant membership, but also it's good political strategy to not put all your eggs in the urban basket. Like you want to make sure that you're making a case for housing funding and housing policy that covers, all the different communities that we represent. So those were what we got from the campaign. I would say the two things that we did not do a good job on with this particular effort was we were not able to coordinate well with the national campaign. The timing was really hard for us. We ended up with 5 huge bills dropping within a two-week time frame, and we just didn't have the capacity with a small staff to do both the heavy push on the legislative front and run a campaign that had integrity. And so we had to take a little pause off the national. It would have been nice to kind of use that and augment their voice. And certainly we hope in the future that we can be better time. I think the other challenge that we have is that housing is a very noisy space in Colorado right now. And this wasn't new news. It certainly reinforced what people already thought. So I don't have a great solution to that one. We're working a lot on like, how do you message this and how do you talk to people about it so it's relevant and critical whenever this issue comes up. So those are the two things that I think as I watched it unroll, I would like to kind of work on and ponder for the next time around that we do this. So you want to know how well we did? Yes, in fact, we did obtain long-term dedicated funding. Super exciting. We also got a short-term infusion of cash to solve sort of what we call the crisis. And we got a lot of clarification around the landlord-tenant relationship in Colorado. So all in all, it was an incredibly successful year. I think the hard work that went into it ahead of time really, really paid off. You know, my political science professor always gave us the analogy of the desert flower, like you should be ready to bloom when that rain comes. And so just having the trifecta is not enough. You also have to be ready with good policy, solid relationships from around the state. A lot of the, some of those issues that I talked about initially, you have to have them at least addressed, if not solved, by the time you come to that legislative table. So it's a short and frantic season. And so the only way you can get really good results is to have everything ready before you can go. And even then, sometimes you can't get everything that we did this year, but in point of fact, this year it worked out for us. So here's what our new funding stream looks like. So 2018-19, you can see the little yellow bar. That's what we had in the past. 2019 and 2020. So we run on a state fiscal year, which starts July 1, which is why I have the double fiscal years at the bottom. So you see for 2 years, we get an additional $7.5 million. And then starting in 2021, we get an additional about $40 million out of the general fund. And then the blue bar at the top, I talked about that crisis funding. We get 3 years of $30 million. It's sort of a cash infusion into the system to try and get over some of these intrinsic market issues that we're dealing with. So I will do a very quick on the actual funding source. It gets super wonky. So if you guys have any questions, if any policy people want to know more, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. The first one we did, the red bar, we call it the vendor fee. This is the amount of money that vendors can keep back of the state sales tax when they charge state sales tax to their customers. So before we passed this bill, it was 3 1/3% that vendors could hold back. This bill actually increased that amount to 4%, but then capped it. So the largest of the vendors in Colorado can only retain $1,000 a month. So a really big hit to the largest retailers in Colorado. But the small businesses actually got a break because they get to keep more of this fee. So I know it's a little backward thinking. And interestingly enough, we didn't get a lot of pushback on the actual amount that vendors did not get to keep. The biggest pushback is that Colorado has one of the most complicated state sales tax structures overall, because we layer state and local and regional and RTAs and all these other mechanisms. And so the pushback we got from vendors was like, you're just making it more complicated. Like they didn't really even blink about the dollar amount, which I thought was really an interesting place to end up. And so they are working on the state sales tax fix, but that's where we got the vendor fee money. The unclaimed property is the amount of money the state kind of holds. It's the refunds and the dividend checks and all those things that come out that they can't find the people that it belongs to. And so the state treasurer ran a risk analysis, decided that only a certain percentage of this money gets collected every year. And then we kind of scraped off the top of that $30 million for 3 years for housing. So another very creative funding source, again, back to why we're in this position, because it's almost impossible for Coloradans to vote on a statewide tax increase. And so we are threading needles, we're looking in the couch cushions, we're squeezing the sponges, I mean, all kinds of political metaphors for us trying to find whatever money we can rather than raising taxes. So that's the results. I can't say all of this was to the Paycheck report, but I do think kind of that continued message of the need, the statewide need, at several levels of your economic system, all along the housing continuum. Those are the pieces that I think finally brought us to this kind of success. So a very successful year again. So that's all I have. I wanted to leave some time if there were questions about how we used the report, how we got what we did. I hope that was helpful for you.
Great, thank you so much, Elena. And just as a reminder to everyone listening in that if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat box through the GoToWebinar service. We do have a few that we'll get started with, and those who enter in later, we can definitely add those in. So first question, was the housing an issue that candidates ran on this year, or was it something that legislators took up after being elected? And is there more messaging needed around the issue, or is it top of mind?
That's a great question. So we did not see a lot of this in the campaign itself. I will say I think the Denver Metro candidates certainly had it as part of their platforms, but I do not think it was a statewide issue. We see it more on local races. So certainly city councils and county commissioner races have housing as more of their issue. And then as to additional messaging, absolutely. I think in Colorado, since you saw that picture of our growth, there's an incredible amount of tension between wanting more housing and a fear of additional development. In fact, our partner to the west, Lakewood, is a city that has a development cap on their ballot in a couple weeks. So there's definitely a lot of anti-growth, and that kind of trickles into anti-housing. And what we're trying to do as a statewide organization is figure out how can we help our local partners and communities with messaging that will resonate at the local level, because it's very personal. And this also shows up, obviously, when people are going for housing, an actual housing project, that there's a lot of, NIMBYism that shows up. And so I think our next kind of pivot as a statewide organization is to start having those more nuanced messages that resonate at a local level. Since at the state level, I feel like we have a very successful result from the session. I will also say, I think, in politics, it's always, what have you done for me lately? And so now I'm working with the Division of Housing on how do we make sure that this money gets spent in a way that's transparent and has equity as, sort of a statewide distribution mechanism, and that projects are not shut out. And then how do we message, looks like a lot of money, but you actually can only bring, even 3,000 or 4,000 units online, and our need is at 20,000. And so there's always that gap. And so you want to make sure that you're not continuing to say, we have a crisis, even though there's all this money, but it's never enough, right? So that's always a very hard place for us to land. I'll be looking to my national partners for some help on that one.
Absolutely. And I guess just to follow up also on something that you said earlier in relation to this question, where you mentioned, that you don't think that housing issues are completely local. I mean, is there kind of a tension in that messaging as it relates to larger regional, national housing trends that you've been thinking through?
Yes. So I think we're actually going to do some engagement sessions with the Division of Housing starting on Thursday. And the way that their policy person characterized that is sort of these cloud issues that really drive a lot of housing decisions but are not politically based or don't have to do with zoning. And they would do with, racial discrimination, economic disparity, long-standing zoning requirements and zoning rules. Some of those things that we can't actually, water in Colorado is one that comes up surprisingly frequently. So those are things that we can actually touch or do anything about from the housing industry, but they certainly affect what we're doing to a great extent.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. All right, so another question that we have is were attitudes to or receptions of, oh, I have actually just left the question. So let me get back to it. Were attitudes to or reception of messaging segmented by particular demographic groups? Um, so this asker is saying that strategizing in Arlington and curious to see what trends we can take here.
We did not do that with this particular campaign. And I think this kind of goes back to having that trifecta of Democrats is that, and it, since we had a huge freshman crowd, a brand new governor, we were really just hitting kind of the big highlights of housing this year. It was not a nuanced conversation by any stretch. And I'm also new, and so I don't even have the nuance yet to share. So this was the big, bold statement, primary colors, it's a need, you know. As I said, I do think now it's time to pivot and start having, as the questioner asked, you know, different messages for different groups, not different messages, but maybe just a different tone and a different take for the different groups that we're trying to work with.
Definitely, and we have another question here, just about rural housing that I think kind of we can maybe wrap into this line of questioning, but they're specifically asking about, you know, if again you laid out those targeted areas and if those target areas were rural, and if they were not, if you could maybe provide any insight that you have into perhaps the similarities or differences that housing affordability looks like in more rural areas of Colorado. And I would just tack onto that as well, you know, if legislatively, if there is any sort of particular, you know, carve out for rural housing issues.
Yes. Okay. So I'll tackle the two questions. I'll start with the rural. How does rural housing look in Colorado? So we actually have two different kinds of rural. One is the rural, and one is our resort rural. And they are both classified as rural for the federal purposes. But I got to tell you, Aspen is considered a rural entity, and it is not rural. So they're essentially little tiny cities that are landlocked, have very tight land use issues, very difficult transportation issues, incredible disparity of income issues, incredible commuter workforce issues, but they just happen to be landed in a rural area. So a little different than I would say are rural if you're talking about like eastern Colorado, which is agricultural, no land use space issues, fair amount of transportation, you know, all those things are different. They just have the housing stock problem. So looks a little different, and two different kinds of policies would address each of those. Now, I'm super pleased to say that the coalition that was built around these pieces of legislation was truly statewide, and we had legislators, senators, and representatives from mountain rural as well as the plains rural and the western slope rural. We're all partnering together, which just did my little heart so much good, because I don't think it's a partisan issue, and I don't think it should be an urban-rural issue. And so one of the strengths of Colorado is that we have a lot of locally driven initiative, and so that shows up when you're trying to do this kind of work. The second question was about, and I'm sorry, I totally spaced it. Can you give it to me again? The second piece of that question?
Yeah, about the legislative approach, and if there were particular attention paid to.
Yes. So there. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, there is some carve outs. The legislation is fairly broad into what we actually have to spend it on. Like when I said at the beginning, the debate about where in the continuum do we spend this, it's fairly broad. There is a small piece that's carved out for strictly below 30% AMI, and then there's also, what do you want to call it, the softer language around encouraging the Division of Housing to spend the money in rural areas. So it's not proscriptive, but there is definitely sort of an encouragement that they make sure that, I think in Colorado, and I think this is true in other parts of the state of the country, it's hard to get state tax credit projects, especially the 4%, built in rural areas because of size, capacity, the numbers don't pencil. We still have all the same costs of driving housing up, but we don't have any of the breaks. So it's hard to make those numbers pencil in rural areas. And so I think a lot of discussions have been around how do we make sure that rural projects get built with this money. from sort of a technical standpoint, but not prescriptive, which again is helpful, so we're not kind of tied in. The other interesting thing in Colorado, and again, I know this is not new, we're starting to feel, the rural areas are starting to feel the urban push. So Lyman is a town I visited a couple weeks ago. It's an hour east of Denver. It's a gorgeous little town way out on the plains. And the last 3 houses that were sold there were sold to people working in Denver and commuting to Lyman. So they are starting to feel the pinch without having their salaries rise in a commensurate level. So it's just going to get worse for our rural friends.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another question that we have, someone is asking, does Colorado's Housing Finance Agency grant funds to Housing Colorado's members?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're called CHAFA, the Colorado Housing and Finance Agency, and they are strong partners. They were strong partners on the legislation. One of the pieces I did not put up here is we actually got the state tax credit doubled this year. I didn't want to feel like you guys were, like I was boasting. So they were also playing the legislative game, and we were all in it together. And yes, they do. Our members are developers and cities and counties and housing authorities that also get tax credits from CHAFA, for sure.
Oh, well, that's great to hear, and we're always excited to have people boast about how they success. So we're more than happy to hear. Someone else has asked, how did the support for the funding legislation play with that for rent regulation? And they're also wondering if Housing Colorado supported both pieces.
I am so glad that question got asked. We did, in fact, have a rent regulation bill. It did not go all the way through the process. The calendar got super jammed up at the end, and that was one of the bills that was so controversial that the leadership decided to pull it. It will be back again next year. So yes, we were playing in all those games. We were really busy. I think with the interesting thing about the way the session unfolded is the funding actually didn't really show up until very late in the legislative calendar. So although it looks like this huge win and we got all this work done, it really only came at the last maybe 3 weeks of the process. Like I said, a lot of work was being done behind the scenes and beforehand. Rent regulation also dropped at a similar time frame, and I just think there was just not enough bandwidth to deal with all this. So I think the leadership decided, let's go for the statewide money, since we've been blocked for so many years from getting that in place. And then let's come back again next year and have the conversation about rent regulation. The way the Colorado Constitution is written, we can't actually do it at a statewide level. There might be an opportunity to do permissive language in state legislation that would allow local cities and counties to pass their own rent regulation policies. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation this summer as we try to be I would like Housing Colorado to be positioned as sort of the technical expert in the room, where we don't have to say yes or no. We can say, here's policies that have been wildly successful in other parts of the country, and here's policies that have not yielded increased supply of affordable housing. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll be back here next year, and I can tell you where that conversation went in Colorado.
Absolutely. And I guess just a follow-up on that, since there has been this kind of nationwide, or I guess, across multiple states, these pushes for rent regulations. I mean, what has the timeline kind of looked like so far as that conversation, as well as, the conversations around the legislation that was passed? Have those, you mentioned that the funding was kind of a last minute push, but maybe with rent regulation, has that been something that's been percolating for a while, or is that also a new conversation?
I actually can't answer that question since I'm new. It was the first that I had heard of it, but I'm new to housing, and so I don't know the answer to that.
All right, no problem. And as another follow-up, someone has asked, who will distribute the funding, and is also asking if it will be competitive.
That was also one of the debates I didn't put on my slide. There was a fair amount of discussion about whether or not the money should go through our housing authority or through the Division of Housing. It was decided that the Division of Housing would be the distributor, and their current system is competitive. I think there's still a lot of conversation around if that's the most appropriate mechanism now that the amount of funding has increased by so much. Colorado is a competitive state, and it's kind of how we're used to doing business. And so my guess is we're probably going to stay with that model, but I can't say that for sure.
Great. Another person has asked, were you able to do anything with the new opportunity zones?
We do have one that's coming online. I know I talked about Lyman, this little town out to the east. They are in the process of putting together, of seeking funders, investors for that. I know of another one they're trying to pull off the ground in Sterling, which is another town on the Eastern Plains that's looking for workforce housing for a big meat packing plant that wants to move out there. We have a couple in Denver that I think are getting penciled in. That did not get swept up into the legislation. These are all independent efforts, and that's actually run through the city of Denver is handling all our OZ issues this year. So we haven't been able to pull one off completely, but I know a lot of them are sort of simmering on the stove right now.
Great. Just on a return to that funding too, we have a question that came in that is asking if there is interest in pairing funding with LIHTC equity.
Yes. The short answer is yes. CHAFA, which is our Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, and the Division of Housing have partnered for years and years and years on deals. If you look at the deal structures, they almost always have a mix of all these different funding pieces. So I have been assured by both Division of Housing and CHAFA that relationship will continue. I think they both find it very fruitful to have several different pots available. In fact, this statewide engagement that we're embarking on Thursday, Division of Housing and CHAFA have both sent their division director and their deputy directors are going to be doing the presentations, which I think just shows an incredible solidarity and also confidence that they can continue to work together to get more projects built and off the ground.
Great. And so we have one final question, unless anyone would like to submit, one more last-minute one. But despite the Democratic trifecta in the legislature, what pushback was there around the legislation that was passed? And they're specifically inquiring what kinds of concerns did Republicans raise?
So I'm going to take I'll take the three bills since I've now mentioned state tax credits. The state tax credits, the pushback was on the private activity bond cap, which, we still struggle with. We're definitely hitting it in most parts of the state. The vendor fee, like I mentioned on the phone, the pushback was really that the sales tax system is already too complicated. Interestingly, the way the sponsor wrote the bill, since so many small businesses benefited, the Republicans actually were surprisingly surprisingly tentatively in support of it because they did not hear a lot of pushback from their business community. So that was kind of an interesting way to get both sides of that issue. The unclaimed property, the pushback was the risk. Like, this isn't actually our money to spend. It really does belong to the people, even if they haven't claimed it. And so we're taking a fairly substantial risk by spending this money. And, what if the actuarial tables are wrong and the money does get claimed, then the state's going to be on the hook for it. So really the pushback was around sort of these technical issues, not around housing as a viable use of state funding.
Got it. And so I spoke too soon. We do have another question before we let you off the hook here, but this person is asking, are there any affordability requirements associated with the use of new funds, like income of tenants? And I think you did touch on this briefly, but maybe if it'd be helpful just to, lay those out.
Yes, and I can give a full debrief on all the different ins and outs of the bill. The unclaimed property does have a requirement the vendor fee does have a requirement that 30% of the funding be spent on those at 30% of AMI or below. The other language in both bills is more permissive, so the home ownership piece can go up to 120% AMI, but it's not capped, it's an up to, or it's not, below, it's above. And those, I think, are the only income restrictions. The challenging piece in Colorado around incomes is, as I mentioned, with our rural communities, their AMIs are so low that if you start capping at particular AMIs, they can't provide the housing that they need to. So we've been really sensitive on the legislative front to not use those metrics in ways that would preclude communities from accessing the funds.
Got it. And just as one more follow-up, I missed this part of the question, but they also are inquiring about if there are time restrictions.
The bill, so the unclaimed property, oh, you mean, it's the question, so if it's in terms of spending the money, I don't know what the rollover is. I'd have to check in with my division folks on what that is. The vendor fee is not a sunset bill. It is into perpetuity as long as we can continue to defend it and make the case for it.
Great. Great. Well, that seems to be the long list of questions that we've worked through, and it seems like there's been a lot of interest. So we thank you so much for taking the time to let us know what's happening out in Colorado. And again, we're very excited to hear about successes, and as you said, maybe we will be hearing from you all again next year to see what other things get passed in your state, and what all the great work that Housing Colorado is doing. So thank you for being one of our very valuable members and for all the work that you all are doing out there. Before I let everyone off of the webinar, I would just like to plug that we have our upcoming Restoring Neighborhoods webinar for next month, planned for July 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It is going to be a joint presentation from Shauna O'Shaughnessy, the President and CEO of Community Housing Improvement Program, and Sonia Costa, Policy Analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and they're going to be discussing natural disasters and housing. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone join us for that. And finally, as you all know, the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force aims to uplift local research, policy changes, and best practices to help us explore connections between housing and other community development issues. And here at NHC, we want to hear from our members, and we want to know what's happening in your neck of the woods. So if anyone who's been listening in has been inspired by Elena's great presentation today and wants to provide an example of good research, policy change, developments, or more that you'd like to share, please feel free to email me at npark@nhc.org. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you all at next month's Restoring Neighborhoods meeting. Have a good day, everyone.